The first battle of the Civil War will be known as the First Battle of Bull Run or Manassas. It will take place on July 21st, 1861. Now, many people at this time believed that the war would be over with after one large battle, that one large battle would decide everything. And if you were a young man in that generation, you did not want to miss this battle. Battles in this war were still kind of looked upon as glamorous, almost like a party atmosphere at this point. Even congressmen, other politicians, and civilians didn't want to miss out on the biggest thing of their generation or of the time. So as the troops trained on both sides and then plans were made for what would become this battle, a lot of people decided that they wanted to go out and they wanted to witness it because it was going to be historic. So you had politicians and their wives and or girlfriends getting in their carriages and coming out from Washington because the battle didn't take place too far away from Washington. They had their picnic lunches, their opera glasses, and off they went to witness this historic battle. And so they're there with their fried chicken and their potato salad, and they begin to hear the cannon go off, and they're looking, trying to kind of see what's going on. Well, in that time period, once you had a couple of volleys from the weapons, you would have a lot of dust coming up in the air, a lot of smoke, and it would be difficult to see. All of a sudden, they began to see troops running towards them, which turned out to be Union troops passing by. And as they were going by, they started shouting, "Oh, the Confederates are right behind us." So suddenly, these congressmen had to get the brides, get their wives and or girlfriends, get in the carriages, turn around, and on this one road, try to make it back to Washington ahead of the advancing Confederate troops. It was chaotic, to say the least. And a lot of people were terrified. They didn't know what was going to happen. And had the Confederate Army kept on marching, they very likely could have taken Washington at that point because it was so unorganized then. But the Confederates themselves were also somewhat unorganized. There was a concern of going too far too fast, and so they kind of withdrew so that they could regroup, and that gave the Union forces time to kind of stabilize the situation and get prepared. Now, while this battle was going on, initially the Union had been doing well, and it looked like the Confederates were the ones that were going to start running. And in fact, some of the troops had. One Confederate officer kind of confronted some of those troops, shouted at them and said, "How can you run? Look, there sits Thomas Jackson sitting like a stone wall with his troops, and he's not moving. How can you run in the face of that kind of heroism?" And the troops looked and they saw Jackson sitting there, and so they kind of turned around, regrouped, and they started launching an attack. Jackson is going to get a nickname from that. He will be referred to as Stonewall Jackson. Once Robert E. Lee takes over as the main general for the Army of Northern Virginia, Jackson is going to be his right-hand man until Jackson is going to be killed during the war. So the Union has lost this first battle. Lincoln is going to replace the commander at the time with George B. McClellan, who has the nickname Little Napoleon. George McClellan is a great organizer, but he never really wants to use the troops. He always complains that he doesn't have enough troops, that he doesn't have enough supplies, enough weapons. That's not true. He's always going to be far better supplied than the Confederate troops ever will be. He will always have more troops, but he will never see that. He makes really bad comments against Lincoln. He does not show him a lot of respect. And McClellan is going to be a difficult general for Lincoln to have to contend with. Lincoln's problem in the early years of the war is trying to find a general who will fight, who will lead his troops, and who will be able to go toe-to-toe with Robert E. Lee. So it's going to be like a revolving door that happens on the northern side until Ulysses S. Grant will come from the west to take over the army in the east. You're going to have two theaters of war, the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater. And Grant will kind of earn some of his fame and his great success in the Western theater, and that will lead to him being brought east to go up against Robert E. Lee. From July 1861 to March 1862, McClellan trained his troops. Lincoln impatiently ordered him to take Richmond immediately, and so McClellan preferred to advance to the city by way of the peninsula between the York and James rivers. He wanted to go very slowly. By the 1st of May, he was leading an army of 112,000 men of the peninsula. A Confederate force of 85,000 men was preparing for battle. In the early stages of the Peninsular Campaign, Robert E. Lee replaced Johnston, who was wounded, as the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. And together with Stonewall Jackson, Lee forced McClellan to retreat after the so-called 7 Days battle fought between June 26 and July 2nd, 1862, near Richmond. McClellan failed to capture Richmond, even though he got so close he could hear the bells in the churches, and was driven back. Lincoln was so dissatisfied with McClellan's failure that he named Henry Halleck general of the overall army, and Halleck brought John Pope from the west to lead the forces in Virginia. Jackson and Lee easily outmaneuvered him in August 1862, and his effort to seize Richmond also failed. Jackson led his force to the rear of the Union Army and broke its communications, and then before Pope could isolate Jackson, the Confederate detachment had rejoined Lee. United, Lee and Jackson defeated Pope on August 29-30th at the Second Battle of Bull Run and forced him to retreat. Lincoln replaced Pope with McClellan once again, and in early September, Lee crossed the Potomac into Maryland, and on September 15th, some of his troops under Stonewall seized the Federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, capturing 11,000 men and 13,000 small arms. But Lee soon walked into a trap. His orders to the troops fell into McClellan's hands. A Union private found the orders wrapped around 3 cigars that a Confederate officer had accidentally dropped. On September 17th, McClellan attacked Lee at Sharpsburg on Antietam Creek, the glorious battle in American history up to that point. Lee had 40,000 men with him, and all were actively engaged. McClellan 70,000, but only about 46,000 took part in the battle. McClellan didn't take advantage of this. This battle is actually going to become like a stalemate. He is going to allow Lee to slip away and not going to pursue him. Lincoln is just furious over that. But because the North technically didn't lose this battle, Lincoln is going to decide that he will issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This was something that he had been wanting to do, but his cabinet had encouraged him to wait until the Union had a significant victory in the East, because they didn't want people to look at this as being kind of a last-ditch effort by the Union to try to win the war. And so they wanted a victory, and the significance of the Battle of Antietam is this was the closest thing to a victory that Lincoln had had, and as a result, he will issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It's going to be issued September 22nd, 1862, to go into effect on January 1st, 1863. Under it, all slaves in areas still in rebellion against the U.S. would be free. It shattered the Confederacy's hopes for foreign recognition, gave Union commanders authority to recruit ex-slaves, and turned the war into one to end slavery. Not until the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865 was slavery abolished in all of the states. In early November 1862, Lincoln replaced McClellan with Ambrose Burnside. A month later, at Fredericksburg, Burnside committed one of the worst blunders of the war. After neglecting to move against smaller Confederate forces that were exposed to attack, Burnside then struck, charging well-entrenched Confederate forces. When the smoke cleared, Burnside's losses totaled 12,600 men killed or wounded, as compared with Lee's 5,300 casualties. In January 1863, Lincoln replaced Burnside with Major General Joseph Hooker, and Hooker is primarily known because his name, a lot of historians think, was given to what we refer to prostitutes as today, because there were a lot of prostitutes that followed the army and kind of camped around his camp. And so they would have the soldiers kind of come and visit them, and so kind of by association they began to be referred to as hookers. In the spring of 1863, Hooker led an army twice as large as Lee's, and crossing the Rappahannock River above Fredericksburg, he attempted to cut Southern supply lines in Virginia and force the Confederates to retreat. But Hooker failed to take the initiative, and Lee defeated the Union Army on May 3rd near Chancellorsville. But unfortunately for him, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own troops and died, and this was a huge loss for Lee and for the Confederate Army. Union troops were having greater success in the West. As I said, Grant had taken Nashville. He is kind of working his way down, trying to take control of the Mississippi River. From the beginning of the semester, I have talked about the significance of the Mississippi. It's still that way. He is going to lay siege to Vicksburg, Mississippi, which will basically finally surrender on July 4th. And that's going to coincide with victory at Gettysburg for the Union. This was a 3-day battle, and it's going to be a huge victory for the North. The Confederate Army is never going to be able to invade the North again. You're going to have a national cemetery established at Gettysburg as a result of this. This is where Lincoln is going to give the famous Gettysburg Address. Grant becomes General-in-Chief March of 1864. His second-in-command, William Sherman, is going to march throughout the South, bringing devastation throughout that area. He will take Atlanta in 1864, and then on April 9th, 1865, Grant and Lee met in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, southwest of Richmond, and a surrender is signed. April 14th, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, and he will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. He dies the following morning, and Andrew Johnson becomes the new president.